My name's Joel Cohen. I'm a politics student at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, in London, which I guess you can read as soon to be a graduate and soon to be an unemployed graduate. I'm also a freelance journalist, which you can kind of also read as a sort of unpaid journalist. So that's why I'm interested in this session, Youth Today, Unemployed or Unemployable. In the start of the riot strand, the first debate that we had in this room here today, the idea of the workless poor with reference to the riots came up quite a lot. But it seems that there not being enough jobs in our economy is kind of only half the story. And in chairing this session, I'd like to hope that we could gain some insight into the politicisation of young people in work with regard to the riots, but also to ask how young people approach the world of work, to ask whether or not they're just unemployed or whether or not they are indeed unemployable. What this involves is a question of asking how we reproduce initiative in our society and how we do that in the context of the workforce. So to debate these things, we first have Shiv Malik, who will speak first, who's investigative journalist for The Guardian and is also co-author of this excellent book, Jilted Generation, How Britain Has Bankrupted Its Youth. He's also a contributor to Prospect. Speaking second will be Pete Smith, sitting on the far side there, who's the Director of Tourism at St Mary's University in London. Thirdly to speak, although if she doesn't arrive, she might not be speaking, is Tess Lanning, who is a research fellow for IPPR, the Institute for Public Policy Research. She's also author of a report called From Learning to Earning, and if she comes down, she'll be speaking. The final speaker that we'll have is sitting to my right, Joe Lopez, who's head of technical excellence at Jaguar Land Rover and does a lot of work with their apprenticeship scheme. He was also employed by them as a graduate and has kept with the organisation all the way through to the modern day. So without further ado, Shiv, you have about 5 to 7 minutes to give us your take.
We seem to have a problem with our young in this country. We're sort of a bit dysfunctional. It's as if we don't really like them that much. And when I say the young, I don't mean children. His mother was with babies already have a rough enough time in public. I'm talking about young adults here. Teenagers, people who are slightly older, up to about 30. It's as if we treat them as second-class citizens in their own country. We seem to, it's worse than that almost. It's like we despise them. So when something like unemployment comes along, it's clear what our country's reaction should be. It's not only a message of, well, they should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. What we need is a bit more get up and go. It's a bit more pernicious than that. It's a bit more insulting. It's a bit more hateful than that. It's the message of it's their fault. If you're unemployed, it's your fault. And we deride them. We call them directly. We call them lazy. We call them feckless, slovenly, useless. And everyone from the CBI to the government to the media loves to have a pop at our unemployed youth. We even have acronyms for them, which makes it even more fun. We call them kippers, kids in parents' pockets eroding their savings. We call them iPods. I think it was, Giles Hattersley, and he coined this wonderful acronym, an infantile posse of overindulged drunks. This is how we treat our youth today. And it's not just words. It's not just words at all. It's far worse than that. We build punishing schemes for them to enter. Because they're unemployed, they must be punished. And these schemes range from everything from what we have currently, forms of workfare, where people must work for free for a very long time without pay. All they get is JSA, which amounts to, for young people who incidentally get less because they're young, something around £50 a week. So it's very minimal. And they must work for, well, it started with 2 weeks, then it went to 4 weeks, then it's 8 weeks for free. Unpaid. And it was at one point until the government realised that the outcry was so great about this, these people were working for Tesco's and supermarkets and large multinational chains. all who had the capability to employ these young people, but were happy to have them stack shelves because these people needed the experience because they were unemployed, so they must be, in a sense, punished. And yet, the funny thing is, there's this great mystery at the heart of all of this. We've had a financial crash, we've had a recession, we've had a second recession. And that seems to not factor into any of this calculation about how we treat our young. The figures are quite stark. Before the recession, before 2008, we had around 1 million people in total of the population unemployed. A little less in some cases. It was kind of dipping and rising, but around that level. After that, we had 2.5. By the end of 2010, it was 2.5 million unemployed. There's an extra 1.5 million who are unemployed. We've also had rocketing youth unemployment in that time, rising to a level of about 1 million. How do you explain this? In fact, this is happening across the EU. What's going on here? Across the EU now there's a report coming out on Monday. I shouldn't really tell you this, so don't tweet it, I might lose my job. But we've got a report out coming saying that there's 14 million NEETs. Those are those who are not in training, education, or employment across Europe. 14 million of them now. So how do you explain this sudden rise? If it's their fault, well, clearly there's a rash of laziness going on. That's what the problem is. Suddenly, within a few years, we've seen a lot more lazy people. That must be the only explanation to this factor that young people are to blame for their predicament. Young people and young people solely. Because obviously the market does these things right. The market would allocate people if they were willing to work, if they were willing to get up and out of their bed, stop playing with their Xbox, and get themselves to their local high street. Only then, if they could do that, then it would be fine. It would be absolutely fine. But we all kind of know that this is really quite rubbish. But nevertheless, that kind of language continues. Even though we have the most educated generation in human history, we even like to deride the degrees that they have. We call them Mickey Mouse and useless, and we call them slovenly and work shy at worst. So it's quite clear that kind of this idea doesn't really work. It's like the medieval doctor who says, well, this person is coughing and spluttering and has all sorts of things wrong with their bile and their humours. Bring on the leeches. That's what we need. And in fact, when things go even horribly worse, rather like now with the government, they say, well, let them work for longer, for free for longer. So now workfare increase to something like 6 months. You have to work 6 months now when the rules change come in for free in order to maintain and keep your benefits. The sanctions regime have become tougher. So if it's not working, we'll make the sanctions tougher. Let's make sure that these people, if they make a third mistake, will not get their benefits for 3 years, because that's the way in which to deal with all of this. It's like the medieval doctor saying, as the person dies and lies dying on their deathbed, bring on more leeches. So this is basically what we've done as a country. This is what's really awkward. The argument doesn't hold any water. I'm running out of time, but I'm going to say what I think is the actual problem. Very briefly, what we have is a crisis of demand. Well, we're told we have a crisis of demand, but actually young people are the source of the greatest demand in our society. And in a sense, we haven't really, they're the people who will start their lives, who have at the beginning of their lives all of these things that they want in life, their hopes and dreams and aspirations, everything from starting a family to buying white goods, and filling their homes with things, having a home to start with, and of course going out and being entrepreneurial and starting businesses. This is what we want young people to do, and yet we seem to chain them and hold them back and blame them for their own predicament without really giving them any help. In fact, employers are themselves obviously taking advantage of the situation, and when it comes to things like interning, they make sure that young people work for free for as long as possible. Why not? They can take advantage of the situation. So we don't really have a demand crisis. And to finish off, in a sense, I think young people are really doing all that they can, absolutely all that they can, everything from roughing it to working for free for months and for even years on end, and even paying ridiculous tuition fees to educate themselves in a world which is globalized. So just to finish, and I'm going to wrap it up, they are trying to get ahead. It's not their fault. And really, hopefully, we'll discuss afterwards what the real solutions are, because that kind of language doesn't help. The schemes aren't helping. We need to find a new way forward.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I'm going to be taking a very contrary view and looking at the age group of most people in the audience. If you'd like to keep your fruit in your bag and throw it, at the end, that'd be great, because I'd like to try and make my 5 minutes not sound like a 40-year-old bloke moaning at people half his age, but I fear that that's actually how it is going to come across. And I want to do two things first. Firstly, I really want to knock on the head the argument that this younger generation of 20, 30-somethings is somehow uniquely jilted, poorly off, poorly served, or particularly disadvantaged. I think really there's a case of historical amnesia here. And by any measure, educational opportunities, disposable income, employment and consumption habits, today's young people, and maybe I'll include myself in this, have better opportunities than generations in the past. And I think if you were to look at all of our families, I won't give you my plotted history of my family, but I think if we were seriously to look at our families and where we are in relation to them, I think that would bear that out to be the case. People don't, by and large, fight in wars, work down mines, live in slums, and all the things that you could get into a Monty Python sketch. That Monty Python sketch where they all moan about what it was like in their day. But I hope you get the point that I'm trying to make. The second point, I think it is important to acknowledge. In the UK, there is long-term structural unemployment. And as we know, that's concentrated in areas where there were previously heavy industries. It's very geographically located. And that is a sad indictment of the market in the inability to provide meaningful work for people. As a sort of aside, I would probably suggest, however, that structural unemployment actually impacts more on people of an older generation, particularly older working class men and more recently women. And of course, economic growth is the answer to all of this, and I think we shouldn't shy away from holding a sort of mirror up to the economy and the government to argue for economic growth. But I think we also need to take a step back. And I want you all to imagine a society, and perhaps one that we would all probably like, one where we all quickly gain meaningful and reasonably paid employment, where graduates all enter lucrative, creative and meaningful work immediately on graduation, such as Joel, where college leavers all start good, well-paid jobs making use of their brains and the jobs aren't too dull and repetitive, and school leavers gain interesting work that challenges their creativity whilst also paying well. And I'm sure that's a society we would all like. But it's never been like that. It's never been the case. There never has been a golden age. Work has never come easy to anybody, particularly young people entering the labour market. It's always been a struggle. The experience of the working class in particular was often of boring, repetitive, hard work, and in the past maybe alleviated to some degree by wages won by trade unions. But the important point is that there never was a golden age. And the pursuit of work for young people, as I said, has never been easy, and work has been frequently hard and, frankly, unrewarding. But what work does give, and particularly young people, is independence and self-reliance. And in the past, this was the central motivating factor for people, independence and self-reliance. All the better if the job was enjoyable, engaged the brain, and was relatively easy, but that independence and self-reliance was key. What I want to argue today, or what I want to suggest, is the importance placed on that independence and self-reliance is far lower down the list of priorities for far too many young people in Britain today. You can throw your fruit now if you're all ready. Okay? This week's unemployment figures have just been released, and number crunchers will probably understand them better than I. But in the UK at the moment, employment is at a record high of 30 million. There are currently 476,000 unfilled vacancies. And if you go back under the Labour years, loosely 1997 to 2007, close to 2 million new jobs were created in the UK, which might come as news to people. Yes, many of these were low-paid, low-skilled, but people born outside of the UK took up the vast majority of those jobs, a trend that has continued till more recently. These figures have been pulled apart and debated, and if Tess was here, she'll probably be able to explain more, and I'm sure Shiv will know them perhaps more than I. But it's very clear that the majority of new jobs created in the last few years, or the last 10 to 13 years in the UK, are taken up with people coming into the UK and entering our job market. In short, migrants now do jobs previously done by British people, and often young people. If you think of industries in the service industry, hospitality, food processing, farm work, etc. And sure, these are often hard work, low-paid jobs, but work nonetheless. And in short, I'd suggest that these are jobs that British young people are simply not prepared to do today. And more anecdotally, and this isn't an anti-immigration point by any stretch, think about here in London, where the biggest growth in employment has been. When was the last time you were served in Costa by anybody who's British. When was the last time in a Tesco's Express you were not served by somebody who was coming from overseas? And this certainly isn't an anti-immigration point. Good on them. Ambitious migrants with a get up and go to move here, start a new life and get on with things. A hard job may be, but perhaps a spirit sadly lacking in far too many of British youth. And before you all get carried away and throw the fruit at me, I mean, of course, there are many young people with similar get up and go and ambition. You know, many of you here today volunteering, here in the audience, maybe including Joel in this. But I think what's important and what is new today is the climate in which youth is discussed. Today the issue, I'd very much argue the counterposition to Shiv. Today the issue is considered from everybody from David Willits down, that young people are somehow victims of their circumstances, rather than energetic people with the potential to make and remake their world. Young people today are seen as in need of constant support, encouraged to settle for nothing less than those well-paid jobs, actually crushed and hurt when that doesn't come good, and viewed as rightly indignant when the jobs available are less than rewarding. And to reveal my colours a little bit, to misquote an old friend of mine, young people make their own history. They do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selecting circumstances, but are already existing circumstances, a circumstance where the job market is hard. They certainly don't make their own history sitting around on their mum and dad's sofa, watching daytime TV, and moaning that the world owes them an interesting, well-paid, creative job.
Well, I'm going to come this slightly differently. I'm going to talk about demand. So I represent Jaguar Land Rover, so I represent the automotive industry, and the automotive industry in the UK is thriving. Moreover, premium automotive vehicles are selling more than ever. We are the second largest producer of premium automotive vehicles in the world. But why is that the case? And the case really is the market, the global market as manufacturing interact with, is demanding, and we as manufacturers in the UK are meeting that demand. Typically, for instance, for JLR, we're selling 20% of the UK's exports into China. It's just one company. We are increasing our sales in the UK, the US, in Europe, and that's based on we're meeting that demand. So the product demand is there for our type of products. And we're employing 24,000 people globally now, putting £3 billion into the UK economy and £4 billion into UK supply chain. So all this news means that we've got the demand for jobs. Now, advanced manufacturing businesses like Jaguar Land Rover have a diverse range of roles, so semi-skilled, skilled and graduate jobs. And my focus is going to be on engineering because that's where I am, so bear with me on this one. But the challenges for that, whilst we have those jobs, is filling them. The quality of people leaving school and university, from our perspective, has thrown some problems out. And that is the fewer people doing maths, science, technology subjects, is what they call the STEM subjects. Not only that, it's the relevance of the education that people are receiving. We need people. We are a business. We're not an educational establishment. We need people with the raw materials to progress in our business. We have many vacancies at the moment, but we're struggling to fill them with skilled engineers. You know, over the last couple of years, we've created 8,000 jobs in the UK across all those areas, in plants in Midlands and in Merseyside. And we have many more applying for those roles. But it's not just Jaguar Land Rover, because the majority of employment in the UK is smaller companies. So there's smaller, medium companies who actually, whilst we as a large provider might have some development opportunities, smaller companies actually need skilled people straight away. So are we providing our youth with the right skills? And are youth actually looking for those skills? Do they understand what's available from a manufacturing perspective? The lack of skills is a significant barrier to growth. Now, how do you address this? Well, in reality, industry and government must work together. Manufacturing has an image of being dirty and grubby and rather unglamorous, perhaps. Part of that is driven by a culture of in post-industrial economy as we are. Part of it perhaps by media. And when was the last time you saw any news story illustrated on television about engineering that didn't cut to some sort of manufacturing plant stamping pieces of metal? That's not reality from an engineering point of view. That's not how engineers work, not how engineers, as part of their job, actually are creative. You know, government have the responsibility to use levers under their control to support and promote a shortage of engineers and to support activities that could grow the type of skills that we need. It's clear that many companies engage in that agenda. For us, with our schools partnership centres, we see 20,000 children, or students, I beg your pardon, students through our sites each year. 2,000 teachers along with them. But we are only one company. We can only do a certain amount. We need to continue to think of new and imaginative ways to engage with the young people, to engage with them, with their parents, with their teachers, with respect to manufacturing and engineering. So, very simply, to conclude on this, manufacturing industry in the UK is growing. It's growing quite significantly. The job market is growing for us. But we need, as industry and as government, take responsibility to understand and how we interact with young people and grow those skills. Thank you.
Firstly, I'd like to ask Shiv whether or not you think we've moralised our understanding of what a good and a bad job is, to the extent that, you say in the book that we were sold, our generation was sold the dream of the knowledge economy or the creative job. The media jobs are saturated with applications, and internship culture is largely a product of that. But is there not a sense that, we're kind of deluding ourselves that there is this perfect job out there? Shouldn't we get more real in the sense of trying to put our efforts into more of the kind of STEM subjects and science-based jobs? If you yourself said in the book that the knowledge economy was a myth, shouldn't we be waking up from that reality rather than sticking with it?
So it's where you place the blame in that sense, right? It's kind of like, yeah, look, is it the responsibility of young people to wake up from this knowledge economy? Well, okay, look, so what's the history of this? It started with Tony Blair and his big slogan in 1997, if I'm not mistaken: education, education, education. Everyone in this room can complete that sentence. The idea is that 50% of our young people would go to universities. And young people stepped up to the plate. It's amazing. They actually stepped up to the plate, even though the government put up fees to presumably dissuade them at the same time as wanting to attract them into university. This is what's so amazing about it. And now fees stand at $9,000. And yet people are still doing this. Why? Because they think they might get a better future from it. Now, you can't blame them for that. In a sense, if you want to place the blame at the foot of an 18-year-old for ruining our economy, we really are all screwed. Yes, it's true, because they're 18. There's a government, and there are adults, and there's industry, and there's all sorts of other sectors which haven't really bothered to play a role in any of this. We think if we have an education system that's kind of based on the medieval idea of, doing a degree, especially around the arts degrees, where you spend sort of 3 years, hanging in and around your professor, not necessarily getting any extra teaching hours, then everything will be fine. But the analysis was right. The analysis was that we needed better skilled, better trained people in order to compete in a globalized world. Young people didn't ask for globalization, right? They were given it. And they said, this is what our country's going to go through. Fine. We stepped up to the plate. We did what we were asked to do in that sense of a contract. What was the return? Well, really low wages. You said that disposable income's never been higher. Turns out that's absolute rubbish. For young people, it's never been lower. Historically speaking, if the FT did a really amazing study in March, it's the first time that anyone's really done anything like this, and they plotted the rising living standards for every 10-year cohort. And they found that this was the first generation in 90 years which hasn't had a rise in living standards at the start of their working lives. That's how bad it is. That's how bad it is. And it's killing the rest of the economy, because these young people can't buy your Jaguars, right? They're not going to be the people buying the Jaguar. They can barely get a place to rent that's sensible, for the fact that, older landlords are leeching everything out of them. So again, we're not doing this correctly. So it was a dream. We were missold the dream. But it's not our fault that we were missold the dream in that sense. If you want to blame 18-year-olds, go ahead, well done. Pat yourself on the back for it, but it's not going to get anyone anywhere.
So then throw that to Pete, on you just being, anti-aspirational in the sense of...
Nobody's blaming 18-year-olds for the state of the economy. I think we really have to get that nail that one straight away. The economy is as it is, and we all want the economy to be different. We all should be arguing for economic growth. My point at the end, quoting Karl Marx, was to say that the world is not like we would like it to be. And also the world has never been like we would like it to be in the past, if that makes sense. Okay, so what are you going to do? You're going to sit around as young people waiting for things to pick up, or do we get on and remake the world and do the best you can? And my feeling is that British young people have a particular problem with that. I'm not saying everybody. I'm not saying every young person. There's people here who, who've done a lot of work for this conference and getting things organised. There's my students that work hard and graduate and work in various things. So it's not everybody, but certainly there's a cultural climate in which there's an expectation. Rather than seeing work as in, we live in an unideal world and we have to get on. Independence and self-reliance are the key and the most important thing, and the other issues come later. And I think, unfortunately, there's a set of expectations that I'm not saying people shouldn't be aspirational, quite the opposite. What people shouldn't do is sit around waiting for things to be better and expect to be given to them on a plate. And it's always been the case. It's not that we're particularly special in my generation or your generation. It's always been that way. So it's not the case that anybody's blaming young people for the economy. It's just how do you as a young person make and remake your world in the current climate? And the current climate is you need some get up and go.
Doesn't that feel like the rash of laziness argument again? It's just like they're just a bit too lazy. God.
I would suggest that many young people are lazy.
Right.
Okay? And then to bring in Joe, maybe not on that note, but on a slightly different one. As a representative of business and someone in a position where they're trying to compete in the economy, do you think that business has some responsibility of filling an educational void within the kind of systems that the government has put in place in the last few years?
I think business has a responsibility to articulate what's required. I don't think business has a responsibility to bridge the academic void. I think business aren't academic establishments, so the skill set, if you like, for business is not there, but it certainly has a responsibility to articulate the needs to government, to universities, to schools, engage with them at a very close level for them to understand what's required. Ultimately, certainly at the higher end where you are specialising, business will intervene in that roles. But if the basic, as I said earlier, the basic building blocks aren't there, what is business going to do? Business is in a very competitive market globally. It is a talk about globalisation. Part of the globalisation, apart from my business, is that we have global customers. That's it. End of story. 170 different markets. So whether it's in Timbuktu or Taiwan, you are addressing those customer requirements. That has a direct feed through to the skills we need in the UK. So I think business absolutely must engage right from primary school, right through university, articulate, engage, enthuse young people into the world of work and the world of possibilities. And certainly there's no issue here of blame. It's just you need to be able to get in there and roll your sleeves up and do it.
Isn't part of the problem that people just aren't willing to get around the table and talk to each other? So whatever political persuasion you come through, you're all identifying the same arguments, but nobody is willing to actually get together and discuss practical solutions to solve these arguments. So you're just further degeneralising and desensitising the youth of today by saying it's not your fault, or it is your fault, or why don't you go and do something about it? Why not try talking to them and finding out what they want to do and building educational programmes that will give them the aspirations while meeting the needs of the businesses at the same time?
I was just interested in your definition, Shiv, of young people from 18 to 30, and that seems to be a huge gap. It seems to be very different between an 18-year-old and a 30-year-old, and their perception of a young person, their sense of adult responsibility. So is there the problem that Pete says about the idea of being self-reliant and having some independence if we're looking at 30-year-olds as young people who haven't got a clue what to do with their lives?
Hi. I absolutely agree that we should leave aside the blame game as such, but as a practical solution, what do you think about keeping tuition fees as they are, converting some of the universities into polytechnics, and then telling the youth, go there and get skills which you need, because that will help you get a job?
It was mentioned before about how many migrants are coming to the country. The main problem with that, of course, is, and in this debate, sadly, I'm going to point out there is a massive difference between what people will talk about here, which is, oh, my internship isn't paid for, I've got a graduate degree, and a real damaging effect of lasting unemployment in people who never went to university at all. But my thesis is you have a situation where migrants come in for a very short term, but they take that money back out of the economy to give to their families, or they move back out of the country. And with such a high level of youth unemployment that we had even under Labour, isn't it fundamentally irresponsible of governments to allow such high levels of mass immigration, which prevent young people from even getting a foot on the ladder in the first place?
In Scotland, we're not allowed to use the word NEET anymore. It's seen as too derogatory. We have to call them MCMC, which stands for a report called More Choices, More Chances. And part of my job is working with, and it's become just another way of referring to the same young people, as it always would do. My job is to manage a number of the responses to the MCMC generation. And I think this conversation is suffering a little bit in the same way that the last conversation looking at the cause of the riot suffered, and this kind of overestimated, acknowledged sense of change that is imbuing everything, and it's somehow unmooring the discussion in terms of people's responses. So people's responses become attached to their own personal prejudices, which come before, in actual fact, engaging with the discussion. If we look at young people as a category of person between childhood and adulthood, they're moving towards something. It's a kind of teleological kind of process, and ideally we want them to try and move towards adulthood and become independent individuals in their own right. When I was a young person, there was a guy called Norman Tebbit who, in his response to unemployment, he said, "Get on your bike," and that was his attempt to blame young people for unemployment. But I'm not sure whether that is perhaps a potentially positive response to young people these days, saying, "Get on your bike." And I'd like to know what the panel's response, what would their advice be to an individual young person who's suffering and struggling to get a job in today's society? What would they tell them to do?
Yeah, I'll try and merge some of the questions. I think the question 1 and 3, in my mind anyway, about solutions and what can parties do together should they get around the table. I'll put those two together. So here's what used to happen. We used to control the labour market. We used to control capital. We had a controlling system, generally speaking, from 45 to 75. What that meant was that unemployment never actually went above 500,000. Never went above 500,000. So you always basically had a sort of perpetual labour shortage, which was very good for labouring people, which happened to be the majority of the country. It meant that their wages went up, and life and living standards for people who worked went up. And that obviously means that young people did very well out of that system. After 1975, and after that point, under a Labour government started, we never had employment that went below 1 million. So we always had this extra group of unemployed people, and that had the inverse effect. So that's in terms of the historic situation. In terms of solutions, I think Germany has an extremely good system. And it happens to be our system that we gave them after the Second World War. We just got rid of it ourselves. And it's this, which is that businesses have apprenticeships. And we think of apprenticeships as basically a kind of a bung that businesses have from the government. And we take someone on, we train them a bit, and then that's the end of the process. And if it works out, it's great. Germany is a lot more regulated. So they say, right, this is a contract, and you have to stick by us, and we will stick by you. And the government and the education sector step in to fill those gaps which businesses can't necessarily meet on their own. And it's a long-term process for which you get a qualification at the end. So if you want to be a baker in Germany, you have to do this for 3 years. If you want to be a physiotherapist, you have to do this. All these trades are regulated in that sense, rather like lawyers. Lawyers do very well. Why? Because their professions are regulated. They are professions, et cetera, et cetera. Doctors do very well out of the system. But in Germany, this is simply extended to everyone. It means you get great bread and great physiotherapists, incidentally. But it also means that you can't leave if you want the sudden choice, if you want the aspiration to leave and be a graphic designer. It's a lot harder if you're that individual. So there are trade-offs. But in the end, it means that you have a lot more security, and Germany, for it, has a lot less youth unemployment. Unions need to also get involved in all of this. I'm astounded that I went to the TUC and they were like, oh yeah, it's a really great idea. Why aren't unions involved in getting young people into the workplace? They're the people representing workers. And they're literally, in some cases, at the coalface. They should be helping young people in that sense, and they don't do it. That's astounding. So that covers, I think, most of those questions, hopefully.
Okay.
The only other one bit I wanted to address was this progression of adulthood and 18 to 30 and widening it out. The reason is because, well, let me just throw this one stat at you, which is that a third of young British adults are living at home with their parents, under 30. That's why, in a sense, it's very difficult to come to these stages of adulthood if you're still living with your parents. It's very difficult to form a relationship if you're living with your parents. You just don't have anywhere to have sex, for a start. It's very difficult if you're living amongst your friends in a rented house. I know married couples who have been living for years. I was one of them, with other people, because they can't afford to live by themselves. It's very difficult to, in a sense, do all these adult things, and that's why it moved up the barrier to 30. In fact, it's the European Union in this report who've done that as well. Well, we can talk about that afterwards.
The point on polytechnics, now, that's an interesting point. I don't think it's that simple. I came from I was in Polytechnic, Wolverhampton Polytechnic up in the North Midlands, when I graduated. I don't think it's about what you call an institution, it's what the institution does. I do think we do have a language problem in the UK about recognising universities, polytechnics, colleges, and I would extend that to apprentices, because I completely agree with Savik, was in the sense that the apprenticeship programme, when done correctly, is actually a very worthwhile route to employment. Now, we will take apprentices, we'll take them through a 3-year, a 6-year apprenticeship. That's the right method, the mechanism to engage people through a programme of education and practical vocational activity. Sometimes you get a mixture of understanding of what vocational and what academic qualifications are. It's nonsense. A doctor is a vocational qualification. That's what doctors do. They practice. They do an apprenticeship. It's not called an apprenticeship, but that's what it is. There is a mixture in the mind of what is and what isn't a job, and what isn't or isn't the right way of achieving those skills. The point of what I'd say to my son, who's 15 at the moment, about careers and where he needs to go, he just has to. I'm as a parent, you tend to feel quite anxious these days. What's going to happen to your son or daughter as it goes through education? Have they chosen the right subjects? It's a real careful balance between the subjects that individuals enjoy and the subjects that will lead to a meaningful career. So it's a really difficult question. What you'd say, you can't. There isn't a solution. There isn't something I'd particularly say to an individual on what they should be doing to not be an MCMC part of the generation.
Just to the lady at the back about people not willing to discuss things and come together. I think that happens all the time. I think if universities' degrees today are much more focused around employment and employment prospects, but that still doesn't seem to be filtering through. Arguably, I'd probably say there's too much discussion of that rather than just getting on with it, graduating and getting a job and making your way in the world. I'd very much sort of agree with Shiv and Joe. I think the education system has let young people down in many respects, both compulsory education and the sort of promise of higher education. And perhaps a return to that, you're right in terms of names, is it a polytechnic, is it not? That might be a useful thing, and it's the content of what is taught that should be the most important thing. And then going back to this Norman Tebbit thing, does everybody know who Norman Tebbit is? Me. Okay.
We went to the same school, we grew up in the adjacent streets.
Was he horrible then as well?
It's interesting because we banded these things around. Lord Tebbit, now in the Lords, was a fairly right-wing Conservative politician at the time, and in mass unemployment in the 80s, he said people should get on their bike. It wasn't actually directed at young people. It was directed at various geographical reasons. And the point about what he said was the fact that the working class in Britain were moving on their bikes anyway. Okay, there's an absolutely startling figure. Something like 3/4 of the population of Liverpool, I don't even believe this, 3/4 of the population of Liverpool were living outside of Liverpool, pursuing work, which was the working class, geographically moving, both young and old, young and not so young at the time. And I think that is the spirit which is slightly lost today. I've yet to look at geographical movements of mobility around the UK, but my feeling is that people don't move in that way, and people are not prepared to move and move to where work is. So Norman Tebbit, I've probably got a bit of time for, and here's a pop cultural reference. The 1980s comedy programme, Alvida's Aim Pet. Anybody seen that? Look it up on YouTube. It's about a group of Geordies going to Germany. Today, favourite comedy programme, The Royal Family. People sat around in Wythenshawe, young people and other people, watching TV. And I think that actually says something. The climate which is operating is one, unfortunately, which encourages that. And I think we need to break out of it. We need to re-emphasise that independence and self-reliance should be central to what we do.
I've worked in Mexico and Germany and a couple of other places, and one of the things, having worked for a corporation, that I find, and the issue was raised earlier, that even young people who get the opportunity to work, internships or something like that, continue indefinitely. There is no certain point when a company finally says, you've paid your dues and now we're going to put you on full employment. And so having worked in, various countries and seen, and I see it happening quite a lot here, that the exploitation of young labor is continuing or progressing in a way that's extremely worrying. So even people who get great entry-level jobs, do it after having paid years of dues of free labor and not good skills, unless that they were lucky enough to draw attention to themselves and have an advocate at higher levels of the organization.
I will endeavour to make this as quick as I can, but first of all, I'd like to address the statement you made earlier. The last time I was served by a young person in Tesco was this morning, so let's just clarify that. Secondly, I'm not saying, or we're not saying, that young people should be blamed for the economy, but what we are saying is that the government has implemented measures that has led to a decline in the economy, that has led to unemployment, and therefore it should be the government's fault. Secondly, due to budget cuts, which were supposedly meant to reduce the budget deficit in this country, and what they consequently have not done, has led to less mechanisms for young people to be able to go out there and gain the skills to work.
Okay.
First, I'm sorry, wait. I'll be quick. Don't worry. In addition to this, there's been a rise in university fees, and the working class children, who apparently are the least likely to succeed and apparently are most likely to cause disruption, have less of more of a disincentive to go out there and make a better life for themselves, which quite frankly is not fair. Family as an institution in this country has broken down. Do we agree?
Okay.
I've been a pig farmer and a head teacher, and I'm now a writer. And I'm probably everybody's grandfather. So can I apologise to you for what my generation has done, particularly through education? When I was born, you could leave school at 15, but you had to wait another 6 years before you were considered adult enough to vote. Now you can leave at 16 and only wait 2 years before you can vote. And in a year or so's time, you will have to stay on at school until you are old enough to vote. And I think that indicates a certain amount of confusion on the part of my generation, which makes it very easy to blame you for the situation that we've put you in. A few years ago, I had an interview published in The Guardian, where I had gone, as a former headmaster, I'd gone and interviewed a persistent truant who was working illegally for my brother-in-law. And at 14, he kept saying to his teachers at school, if you don't like the way I'm behaving, don't insist that I come here, which is a very rational reaction from a 14-year-old. The upshot of it was he worked illegally for 2 years until he was old enough to leave school. He's working full-time. And my brother-in-law was taking a bit of a chance. But he blossomed. And it's meeting him and others like him as a teacher and subsequently that makes me realise there's nothing wrong with young people. There's probably more wrong in what's been done to them.
Okay.
So I would wish you well.
Okay, the reference to Norman Tebbit I think is useful because it highlights how the discussion of unemployment is a political one in terms of political context rather than just solely structural factors alone, although that is important. For the last 20 years, unemployment, and in particular youth unemployment, has not been a live issue at all. To give you a demonstration, 3 years ago when there was the last Right to Work march in the early 80s, they used to accumulate tens of thousands of people on those demonstrations. 3 years ago it accumulated 300 people, and they were all kind of old lefties who were employed in local government by the look of it. So clearly the political context is actually what we're getting at here. The people who discuss youth unemployment are generally cultural commentators who are using it as a fairly crude stick against the coalition, and are refusing to actually acknowledge things that have changed, particularly around the issue of geographical mobility or the lack of geographical mobility. That has certainly changed. But also how old people are discussed in relation to young people. And what I mean by that, I think this is what one of the panelists was saying, more or less, that young people shouldn't be expected to actually make a contribution to the society that they live in. And that they shouldn't actually have to do anything. So you more or less sign on with hope in your hearts. Whereas as soon as there's VAT, if there's increased taxation on pensioners, the same commentators will say that's okay, and they'll shrug their shoulders. So it does appear to be, I think, where I would question it is the motives around the discussion of unemployment, because it's not really a live issue in society. It's one that's driven by journalists rather than people in society. So that's the first point. But I think they are contributing, if you like, to a culture of fatalism. And also there is a bit of snobbish disdain. How dare somebody work in Tesco's? As it happens, Tesco's is one of the largest employers of managerial roles in the country, outside of education. Tesco's is one of the biggest managerial roles. But again, clearly, people shouldn't be working in Tesco's, and everybody should be having high-paid media jobs.
Just to the chap here, I did say young British person in Tesco's. Okay, all right, fantastic, good. Okay, I wasn't slagging off every young British person. I was making a point about the way that it's perceived. I think that fatalism point that Neil has mentioned is something that I really want to focus on, because I think that is the prevailing view. Everybody feels as though they're hard done by. Okay, and there may be a case that people are hard done by. But what do you do in that situation where you're feeling hard done by? Do you, A, sit around waiting for things to be given to you, waiting for the economy to pick up, waiting for the dream job to come your way, or do you, B, get up and make the best of the world and hopefully re-engage and change it and remake your world? Because this is all about opening up independence and freedom for young people. Sitting around relying on your parents or on the state for handouts, I'm not criticising everybody in the room here, but for large sections of young people, that is the reality. The fact that a third of young people live at home with their mum, frankly, people should be ashamed. Okay, people should be ashamed of that. I've lived in big old windy houses with 10 other people in a shitty little room in Manchester where the Bee Gees were born, interestingly enough. Because the last thing I'd want to do is move back in with my mum. I'd have lived on the street before moving back in with my parents. It's being videoed, so no disrespect to my mum, but you get the point.
All the people on the street, presumably.
All the people on the street. The point is that I think there's sometimes an unrealistic expectation amongst too many young people. That's always been the case. Young people have always had a moan. What's changed, and this is where I really do disagree with Shiv on this, is that the climate in which is discussed from David Willits down is one that at each stage young people are given constant bits of support, this, that and the other. People are encouraged to be rightly outraged when the jobs don't come their way immediately. And the world just isn't like that, unfortunately. It wasn't like it when I left university. It wasn't left it when other generations left university. If I go back to my parents' generation and see what they had to do in terms of work, I'm sure that's the same in almost every family in the room. Okay, it's a very, very different situation than it is today, and I think we just need to recognise that the world isn't necessarily how we want it to be, and the best way to change it for yourselves and open up freedom is to get up and engage in the world.
Thank you very much, Joe.
Certainly, I agree with Peter. I think if you look at the people we employ, young people we employ, that what marks those successful candidates is that level of get up and go. I think the ability to be engaging, to be enthusiastic, to go out there and sell yourself is extraordinarily important. Because, to be honest, employer, whether it's ourselves or other companies, will have a whole range of people to look at. They want to understand what's the character of the individual. They want to understand what marks you out from others. So it's very important to get that get up and go. And I think I was in Brussels last week, and we were presented with some videos showing different cultural stereotypes, if you like, taken by a Brussels company of how young people are engaging with the world of work. And it was very interesting that in certain places, Sweden for one, there was a perception there that, well, I have a state that will help me, so I'll sit on my arse and I'll just let things wash it, because I can go from on a benefit culture. And that was one stereotype. Another stereotype, very interestingly, was Greece, where the perception there for the young person was the state owes me a living. Why should I do anything? that's very stereotypical, but this was actually taken of a video taken of young people looking for jobs in those countries. In Germany, it was quite the opposite. It was quite the opposite. The individual there was recognised they had to sell themselves. I think the issue on internships is a really interesting one. Now, as an industry, manufacturing generally don't do internships, but part of placements where we put paid placements in ends up being a long interview. It ends up for the company and for the individual recognising the strengths and weaknesses, and ultimately leading to a job.
Okay, thank you. Shiv?
How much does Jaguar spend on young people and apprenticeships?
I haven't got the figures, but we've taken, 200 apprentices, 315 graduates this year, so it's a few million.
So, because most businesses don't do any of that at all. In fact, when you're talking about internships, what's interesting is that, again, one case study that's come to me is a company that was sold for £18 million, so not small. It was built on, and still continues to run on, internships, unpaid interns. 85% of its workforce are unpaid interns. And yet it was sold for 18 million. So when I kind of look from my perspective of talking and interacting with young people, I see them working for free all the time. All the time. I see them couch surfing all the time. I see them paying those extortionate rents, which used to be rent controlled. When you guys were younger, you used to have rent control. You used to get your mortgages paid for, your interest written off against the tax that you paid for your work. Don't talk about any of that. But we don't have any of this anymore for young people. Fine. Okay, we'll get on and do it on our own. Except it's quite difficult. It's really difficult, and it's ruining the rest of the country for it. And this is the great lie. Again, and to answer that point about the austerity agenda and affecting young people, how did the cuts fall? How did they fall? Right? You look at how they fell. And who did we beat on first? Well, young people. We cut EMA. We increased fees, we cut back the higher education, we cut back the housing budget, so we don't build any more houses. We did all of those things first. One thing that we definitely didn't want to get rid of, because the Prime Minister ruled it out, was winter fuel payments, which are just a bribe by any other name, because they go to anyone who's over 60, including 2 million millionaires. But we'd rather make sure that we're a country where old people can sort of die comfortably, than make sure that young people can get into the workplace, get on their feet, and have the training and all of those subsidies that we used to give them when we stopped giving them. That's nuts. That really is nuts. And that goes back to that original problem. So we seem to not like our young. It's really disturbing as a country. And maybe the other thing is I'm not snobbish about Tesco's, right? But it's not work. People aren't working for Tesco's. They're going there and doing things, right, and being made to do so, but Tesco's doesn't pay them. And the only way that work is incredibly liberating, but the main bit about work is that getting that paycheck at the end of the week, right? It's getting that thing and saying, you know what, I did this. This is what all of that stuff meant something to someone else, that they gave me some money that I can go and build my life with that. It's not work if you don't get paid. So I am only snobbish about it when people are made to give away their labour for free for menial tasks which do nothing for them. It does nothing for them, almost nothing. And a multinational billion-pound company gets away with it. Doesn't have to pay a dime.
Yeah, I'm 16. I'm currently studying A-levels. 2 weeks ago, I went to SOAS, and there was a British-Egyptian society. There was a talk about education, the best investment, and basically they went there, they talked a lot on vocational experience and more incentives for volunteering, having taken into account academic ability. And one thing that I was doing was, because everyone's talking about get up and go, before I even went there, I went out into Bromley. I was trying to raise a petition. So basically, because most companies shy away from giving experience, because you don't have experience in the first place, what I was doing is basically linking education and employment simultaneously so they can work together. So before you even go to the company for experience, you've already got something to show forth. You've got interpersonal skills and your academic ability. So basically the question I'm trying to form to the panel, whichever one wants to answer it, is that since most companies don't accept unexperienced while in education, before employment, shouldn't we raise more volunteering experience with a source of income? And you can basically call it another EMA, basically.
Okay. Shiv, I'm worried that you're promoting a culture of victimhood amongst young people, and I think that's something which is going to be ultimately disabling for people to view themselves in that way. And surely in terms of the problems you're attempting to address would need to be addressed politically rather than through promoting a culture of victimhood. Pete, I'm interested in where you feel this culture of entitlement comes from, and why it's so pervasive. I'd also be interested to know the views of the panel on all the discussion around apprenticeship and internship schemes, because they seem to me to be very therapeutic. So if you look at discussions around making people work ready, bringing them into contact with social networks, these are things which previously they would have organised for themselves rather than having to have some kind of official support for.
All right. My dad is from Birmingham. I'm Danish. And I want to tell you, Pete, a fucking dream. In Denmark, it's so crazy. I get my education for free and I'm paid to go to university.
Okay, lucky you.
And the society invests in us. We have student councils all over, student organizations, youth organizations that I listen to. Whenever I come over here, it seems to me that nobody really wants to listen to the youth. Nobody really takes them serious. And that has happened for years. That was the reason why my dad left England in the first place. Why don't you learn from that?
Thanks. It's been a very interesting discussion so far, but I feel that it's been focused very much on university graduates finding work. I'm from Sweden, and we have, I think, I don't know the exact percentage, but 20% or so of A-level students fail their studies. They don't actually end up leaving school with the A-levels. And we speak about a lost generation because they're not even going to end up, if they apply for a job, you're not going to even end up being called for an interview. You will end up in the wrong pile. What's your take on this, and what are your thoughts?
Okay, sorry, Joel, I'll be really quick. I know that people will probably say that this is just me being lazy or expecting things from the state or whatever, but as a young person, I find it incredibly depressing to think that for the rest of my life, I'm going to be doing this like weird culture of work that we have, where you work all year round in this job that you might not even like that much, and then you have 2 weeks off a year where you get to go on holiday to Spain or something like that. And I just find that incredibly depressing, like the thought that I'm going to have to come out of university and go into that world. It just like completely depresses me.
I don't find that very depressing, which is a bit strange, but I don't find that very depressing. Just very quickly, Shiv, if you are 20, 21, you've left uni, you're a graduate, and somebody offers you to go into work and just try out work, you might cultivate relationships with managers and whatever. Why wouldn't you do that, even if you weren't paid for it? Why wouldn't you do that? And I don't understand why. I mean, I would do that, and I will do that when I finish university.
I just wanted to kind of say about the issue of the kind of public perception and the media perception of young people. Personally, I'm in my last year of sixth form. I'm hoping to take a gap year in which I'd like to do, preferably to do an interesting internship and do some part-time work to get money, save for uni, or alternatively do some probably fairly boring job full-time. But I think it is really, I do find the media perception really discouraging, to be honest, because so many people, I tell them I'm taking a gap year and they go, oh, you better get that sorted out soon. You really should be thinking about it now. You know, have you decided what you're doing? You know, you really need to know what you're doing. And otherwise, and then I say, oh, I'm hoping to do a degree in English. And they go, well, but that's like what you were saying before. It's one of those degrees where it's one of those knowledge-based kind of degrees. It's not vocational. But I would argue that it's the ultimate degree in learning communication. But I think that I would like to just say that really I feel as a young person quite discouraged, and I think that, you know, how would you respond to that? Do you think that there could be a part played to that?
Okay, couple of very quick points. Shiv, I think you make some really good points, but I'm very worried about this idea of the whole young generation being victims. I think that's really wrong, and I strongly agree with Peter that young people need to show a lot more initiative and endeavour themselves. I think I blame a lot on the previous government about this idea that if you didn't go to university, you're a failure, and it was perpetuated that university was the be-all and end-all. And I would like a bit more of this debate potentially in the future to be focused about what do we do about those. University is not right for everyone, and you can have far more rewarding careers through apprenticeships or going directly to work, and I'd like a lot more focus on that. And it should be valued as much as university. I know time's very... And final point, I think part of the problem was that in expanding higher education and telling all young people you should go to university, a lot of emphasis was given to young people, study what you want. But young people didn't think, will these degrees actually get me the jobs in the future? And we have this really weird phenomena where we have increasing people going to university and we have employers saying we don't have the skills. That's crazy.
I can address the victimhood thing. I mean, very quickly, I don't think, in a sense, I'm certainly promoting victimhood. I agree with you, victimhood would be bad, but I'm just trying to clarify some of the facts around this. Pete, can I be very cheeky? Do you have a degree?
I do have a degree.
Did you get paid to go to university?
You mean did I get a grant? Yes, I did.
How much was it?
Oh, God. Absolutely no idea.
Well, there we go. You don't even know how much you got paid to go to university. Everyone who pays will know exactly how much they get paid. So in that sense, the whole thing about the victimhood thing is there's some facts of the matter, which is that young people used to get supported a hell of a lot. They don't anymore. That's what I like to correct. Should young people get off their backsides, because apparently they're all sitting on their backsides, which refers back to that whole leeching idea again. Bring on more leechers because they're all too lazy. Well, I think they already are. That's the point. And I think they're doing very well at it. It's just that no one seems to want to communally, as a country, this is the thing. There are some things we can do as a country that we can't do individually. Step in and say, you know what, this is what we need to do as a country. And that's really my beef. So it's not victimhood I'm promoting. It really is. Individuals are doing what they can. There's more than this that needs to be done, and it's done at a different level from simply the individual.
Picking up on your point about universities, you're absolutely right. We've got into a culture where university degree is the be-in and end-all, and it's not true. And there are many routes into many roles at different levels with apprenticeships and with experiential. I think raising the point earlier about experience, you can gain experience through various opportunities, and I guess it goes back to the point I made earlier with respect to the individual get up and go. You've got get up and go. You go and do that experience, or you can go and do volunteering work. But to me, you know what? When I look at people's CVs, it's about more than that. You know, it might be about what they've learnt in school. It might be how they've approached things. But we've got many different routes into employment, and we as a country have got into a culture that ultimately a university degree is it, and that's been at the detriment of apprenticeships and other routes into this, where we've got governments talking about technical baccalaureates and engineering baccalaureates. For goodness sake, what we've done is introduced a second, let's say, a CSC O-level type of approach. Let's get away from that. If we can understand that qualifications are on a level playing field and actually give young people an aspiration to do well in whatever route they want to succeed, and also for their parents to support them. To be honest, again, going back to as a parent, parents are confused. It really is confusing at them. What is the right route for their children? How do teachers react to this? Teachers have a big role to play in articulating the opportunities that are out there.
Great, thank you. Pete?
Okay, very quick points. Firstly, for the record, I was against the tuition fees, and I was actually on the demonstration, so there, you might be surprised to learn. Miriam, that's life, I'm afraid. But it is, it is 4 weeks holiday, so it's not quite as bad as you think, rather than 2. Denmark, interesting Denmark, and a lot of the universities over in countries, Scandinavian countries out there. Often, a lot of their courses are provided, degree courses provided in English, no fees. Okay, interesting. We have links to our university, etc., etc. How many English people take them up? Very, very few, because they want to live at home with their mum. So you want a free education? Look up in Scandinavia, move, okay, geographical mobility.
Not get on your bike, get on your plane.
Get on your plane, not your bike, yeah, thank you. Okay. The expansion of higher education, yes, I think there is something in that, and I think that is a bit of an issue. I just want to run some figures by you. Under New Labour, 2 million new jobs were created in the UK. Different people look at it in different ways. One figure is that 90% of those new jobs of 2 million in a 10-year period were taken up by people from outside of the UK who were not born in the UK. Okay. Others say it's 70%. Okay. All right, hold on. The point that I'm trying to make is there are many jobs in the UK now which young people are simply not prepared to do. Be that as it may, I think that's a cultural change and a cultural shift that we have to tackle. And very finally, on this idea of, which was asked by the gentleman over here, about the culture of entitlement, I think it's come from two areas. I think one, under the new Labour government, there was very much the notion of young people needing constant support, essentially codifying young people as victims, which people then begin to internalise, and that's how people view themselves. But the flip side of that, and no disrespect to Joe and Jaguar, companies are also guilty of this. People shouldn't work for free. Any young person that works in an internship for free, forget it, don't do it. Companies should employ people, and companies should actually be fingered for not giving people jobs on the basis that this person's got a bit of gumption, and also not expanding work for young people who will work for them and expecting pieces of paper. But overall, I think what the problem is that there's been a shift. Whereas once independence and self-reliance was what people viewed their position and why a job was important, be it school leaver, university leaver, or whatever, that has now changed, and entitlement has taken over. And I think the point is that by freeing up and focusing on entitlement and focusing on independence and self-reliance is opening up the possibilities for young people. Young people are active agents who can make and remake the world around them. And I think that's the position that we need to move to, where culturally that has more sanction rather than seeing people as in need of constant support and vulnerable victims of circumstance.
Great. Thank you. Can we please have a huge round of applause for our...
Thank you. I love the way you use those cards.